Welcome. In this episode, we will continue discussing the Protestant Reformation, and we will conclude the English Reformation during the reign of Elizabeth I. Well, Queen Elizabeth I, recall, is the final child of King Henry VIII to take the throne. If you remember, all three of Henry VIII's children ruled. Henry VIII had 6 wives, 3 children, but no grandchildren. And so Elizabeth took the throne at a relatively young age. Parliament wanted her, but many of the other powerful men of England, people in Parliament, the other nobles, thought they could control her, maybe marry her. But she never marries. She will, by the end, earn the nickname the Virgin Queen because she never married, never had any children. And for example, when you look at around this time is when exploration is going on and the colonies, the British colonies are founded. That is, for example, one of the first colonies is called Virginia after the Virgin Queen, Queen Elizabeth. Her successor is King James, and the first settlement in Virginia is called Jamestown. So these are all kind of going on at the same time. What else about Elizabeth? This is the age of Shakespeare and some of those high Renaissance Elizabethan era plays. She, again, persecuted Catholics just as savagely as so-called Bloody Mary persecuted Protestants, but in other ways was moderate on many things and sort of cemented Protestantism in England through her long reign because she started very young and then she was queen for 45 years. We would think that was a really long time, except the current Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth II, has been queen for even longer. And so, but again, at this time, this was a very, very long time to be the monarch. The other major event that happens is her brother-in-law, Philip. Remember Philip II, who was the husband of Elizabeth's sister Mary, wants to marry Elizabeth. He says that he's still the King of England, and he wants to marry Elizabeth. And you'd say, well, wait a minute, isn't that what started this whole mess, that they were supposedly siblings in law and then they got married? Well, but in this case, the church never recognized Henry's marriage to her mother and to Elizabeth's mother, and so under canon law, under church law, they weren't siblings and they weren't at all related. So in that case, it wouldn't be incest. And so Philip wanted to marry Elizabeth, return England to the Catholic Church, be king of more places, and Elizabeth sort of puts him off and delays and says she'll think about it, and basically, sometimes maybe really just means no. And so she really just meant no. And so Philip, when he finally takes no for an answer, doesn't take no for an answer and raises a mighty armada, or Spanish fleet, or navy, to invade England, overthrow Elizabeth, and proclaim himself as king. And so he sends this Spanish armada that very famously is defeated by the smaller English navy. They use smaller ships, and the weather cooperated, so that the Spanish armada actually sailed off. They hit bad weather and was like utterly destroyed. This is a major significant event in world history because 1588 with the Spanish Armada marks the ascendancy of England, or Britain, to be the #1 navy in the world, which with very few challenges, England would have the greatest navy in the world from essentially 1588 until World War II, which is a big deal. And so England gains naval ascendancy. And then we will pick up 2 units from now with what happens in England after this, but that concludes Elizabeth's reign. Now, to look at the other aspects of Protestant Reformation. Those are the 2 big ones. We had Luther, we had Henry VIII. Another famous reformer is a Swiss contemporary of Luther named Zwingli. And Zwingli sided with one of Luther's friends, who was a guy that sort of egged Luther on early on, named Karlstadt, and they wanted even more radical reforms. And Luther and Zwingli famously debated each other. And so among Protestants, there was this fierce debate and many different interpretations of who could define what true Christianity is or should be. Another one was the more famous John Calvin, who started as a French lawyer, and he's a young man when all this Luther stuff was going on. Because remember, Luther writes, he's a grown man in his 30s, I believe, when he writes the 95 Theses. So then 20 years later, Calvin is a young man in the prime of life and writes a book called The Institutes, or The Institutes of the Christian Religion. In it, he tries to define what Christianity is, or in his mind ought to be, and it sought to continue the reform. And he's rejected, of course, by the Catholics, but also by the Lutherans, so we see in contrast with, you have Luther and Calvin who are changing and rejecting elements of the church based on theology. Contrast that with Henry VIII and Elizabeth, where it was ultimately just very practical. They sort of were breaking from the political power of the church and ultimately changing very little about the theology, or like what the church is or should be in their country. And so he is rejected many places, his native France, but he is embraced in Switzerland. And they actually invite him to set up a government, a sort of city on a hill, a place in Geneva, Switzerland, where they would be a godly society of Christian people who adhered to what Calvin wrote about. And what are the things that makes Calvin different from Luther and different from the Catholic teaching? Because if you recall that spectrum of reform that we spoke about, you had the Anglicans, who changed very little, Lutherans changed quite a bit more, and the Calvinists, who make many more changes to what the Catholic Church had been up to that point. So in it, he embraces sola scriptura from Luther, because he argues even Luther keeps too many non-scriptural traditions, that he hasn't gone far enough in rejecting things that the Catholic Church had taught and did. Eliminates all sacraments. Again, sola scriptura, sola fides. He accepts those kind of Lutheran ideas. Eliminates almost all church decorations, steeples and stained glass, and those are things that get in the way, and really wants to strip down to the bare essentials. It's very much Bible-based, faith-based, and many other things, he says, the Catholic Church and even some of the other Protestants like Anglicans and Lutherans allow to get in the way of what he sees as true religion. Eliminates virtually all hierarchy. Really, churches are going to be semi-independent. This is kind of that tradition of a local church sort of selecting or electing a pastor, and that's very in the Calvinist Protestant tradition. And especially this tradition, and this is very big in America, the Protestant tradition of splitting off for the sake of conscience. The idea that you have a firm belief in your conscience of what is right and true religion, and if others aren't going to see it your way, that you don't dare violate what you believe to be true, but rather you go off, you be with a community with whom you can share your conscience and your faith and your beliefs. But the most distinctive Calvinist belief, the most famous Calvinist belief, is that of predestination, the idea that your destiny is predetermined. And this is kind of a problem in all philosophy, especially in the West, where you talk about, does free will actually exist? Because if you say that God is outside of time and God knows people's destinies, whether you're going to heaven or hell or spending time in purgatory or whatever, then do you have free will? God already knows, as the teaching goes. And so Calvin really presses into that yes, your destiny is known. You need faith. Nothing you can do can change that. No works will save you. No indulgences help you, and gets away from any idea of purgatory at all. It's heaven or hell. God does it. God knows it. You're saved or you're not. And works themselves don't do anything to save you. They are evidence that prove you are saved. If you sin, it's evidence that you're already not saved. You're a sinner. You are predestined for hell. If you don't ever do things wrong and do lots of holy good things, it's evidence that you are predestined for heaven. And so, interestingly, even though it's this, the Catholics focus too much on what they do and trying to be holy when really there's nothing you can do, Christ saves you, your works don't save you, it actually leads to Calvinists having a reputation for trying really hard to not sin and do good things, because they believe even one slip up could be evidence that all along they weren't saved. And so that's an interesting byproduct of Calvinism. Where does Calvinism go? You'd say, you look around today and say, I don't see any Calvinists. You'd be right. It's relatively uncommon for churches to say that they're Calvinist, but his influence spreads heavily. Calvinism in Scotland is called Presbyterianism. In England, the Puritans are they believe in many of the ideas of Calvin. In France, they were called the Huguenot. In the Netherlands, they were Reformed Christians, or just Reformed, and sometimes just Christian. And so we see kind of that descendant. Now, again, many of these traditions today, those who are more evangelical, Baptist, Christian, Reformed, Presbyterian, they are kind of descended from this bigger tradition of Calvin. Remember that many of these are still the keys, even if his most famous at the time idea of predestination is either rejected or not emphasized in many of these traditions today. They kind of largely come from this Protestant Calvinist tradition. And an interesting distinction at this point. Many people, in my opinion, kind of misunderstand what a theocracy is, and they throw that around a little loosely. When they call something theocracy, what we actually see more often in the world, we would use the term Caesaropapism. Let me explain. In Calvin's Geneva, it was a theocracy, a place where the church and Calvin's rules took precedence. And we're contrasting this with feudalism, this ideal of feudalism where, maybe it's not that idealistic because the middle class and urban laborers and peasants are kind of the underclass and outside of it. But it was this idea that the church and the government are kind of separate. They cooperate in ruling, but they have their own sphere. The Pope and the bishops and the priests and canon law is over here. The king, the state, the civil law is like over here, and they kind of have their own sphere. In a theocracy, the church oversteps that bounds, and the Pope, or in this case Calvin, kind of rules over the government of Geneva, for example. What we see in some of the Lutheran places, or maybe the best example would be Henry VIII, is Caesaropapism, where what you had was Henry the king claiming effectively to be head of the church and not accepting the Pope's authority, and therefore the king can pick the bishops and priests and decide what church laws and policies would be. And so a lot of times when people see a blending of the line between church and state, they call it theocracy, which is church rule of the state, but also realize this fancier word, Caesaropapism, is where Caesar, the king, claims papal authority in a way to be the Pope or the head of the church. And we actually see that just as much, if not quite a bit more, in history than we see theocracy. A couple other ones before we finish off. John Knox, who people might be familiar with, is a famous Presbyterian who brought Calvin's Reformed theology to Scotland. He's the man that brought Protestantism or Presbyterianism to Scotland and is a famous hero in Scottish history and Presbyterianism, and is much more radical than the Anglicanism that was brought there. He famously debated with Mary, Queen of Scots, and was partially responsible for her getting executed because Mary, Queen of Scots, was Catholic, even as many of her people became Protestant, and ultimately that led to her downfall in Scotland. And lastly, the Anabaptists, who are even more radical on that spectrum of reform. They are not the same as modern-day Baptists. They're totally separate. They are closer to Mennonites or the Amish than to modern-day Baptists. They're much more radical. They form kind of these independent communes. They get their name because they reject infant baptism. Only adult, which the Catholic Church, the Orthodox, and I believe still the Lutherans and Anglicans all still practiced. The Anabaptists would re-baptize people because they said infant baptism was no good. It didn't take. You need to be baptized as an adult. They tried to abolish private property and live in these communes, and they believed the judgment day, the end of the world, was right at hand, and they were ready to bring it about and thought it was coming. So why have private property? Why live as people had been living? And they were rejected and persecuted by the Calvinist Reformed, the Catholics, the Lutherans, all alike. And on that spectrum of reform, remember, they mark the biggest change from the pre-Reformation Catholic Church. Speaking of the Catholic Church, our next topic will be the Council of Trent and the Catholic Reformation, or sometimes called the Counter-Reformation. That'll be our topic next time. Thanks for watching.